let's move on to the next question, which is, do you think defending the coexistence of hell with an all-loving, all-knowing God is in some ways similar to a theodicy?
Exactly, it is. It is a theodicy, correct. But in philosophy of religion
Yeah.
and in my book, I draw on a distinction, which is we sometimes distinguish in philosophy of religion a theodicy from a defense against the problem of evil. So, as you probably know, the problem of evil, there are many different versions of the problem of
Yes.
evil. And the general thought of one version was called the logical problem. The logical problem was something like there was supposed to be a contradiction between God being all loving, all knowing, all powerful, and there being evil in the world.
Yes.
Uh, One famous philosopher, Alvin Plantinga, sort of destroyed this view. He replied by distinguishing theodicy from defense. What he said is, to show that there's no contradiction here and that this problem doesn't work, all we have to show is we don't have to give the true explanation of why God allows evil. All we have to show is there's at least one possible scenario in which God would allow evil and there'd be no contradiction, right? Where those three things, God being all knowing, all loving, all powerful, would be compatible with evil, logically speaking. He called that a defense. It's just a possible scenario, but it shows you there's no contradiction between these things. So in my book, I basically say, here's what I'm offering. I'm offering a defense against the problem of evil having to do with hell. So I say that's what I'm doing is I'm showing God could have a good reason for allowing hell, but I'm not going to tell you if this is the right reason. I don't know. And I think ultimately we don't need to show that. I think there are lots of different ways to explain why God allows evil, why God allows hell, and I'm just giving a possible set of scenarios.
That's quite interesting. So it's basically just proof by counterexample.
Correct, exactly.
Okay.
So I give a whole series of counterexamples. Correct.
Hmm. Okay. My next question is a bit of a tangential question, but kind of related is, what do you think is the most convincing theodicy that dispels the problem of evil?
Well, let me say what I just said a different way. So, what I said just a few seconds ago is there are many versions of the problem of
Yes.
evil. And so, in one way, there's not going to be just one answer to everything exactly. That probably is not the best way to think about it. I think, logically speaking, Alvin Plantinga, the guy who came up with the original response to this problem of evil in the modern form, with
Yes.
J.L. Mackey's logical problem of evil, Alvin Plantinga's response, I think, is the right one. And what he pointed out is there's only one thing I need to show. There's one easy, obvious, immediate answer to this problem that is like the form of the right answer that everyone is going to give. And I think the form of the right answer is basically this. Why does what do you need to show that there's no contradiction? You just have to say it's possible. God has a good reason. That's it. That's it, right? Because logically speaking, as long as there's a possible good reason God could have for allowing evil, then there's no contradiction. So I think logically speaking, the problem of evil in every version is resolved by that general form, is by saying God has a good reason.
Right.
Okay. But that's not you might say there are lots of complications about offering those answers. So let me just give a more specific two thoughts. Okay. In the book on hell, I note there's a special way that the problem of hell involves a different version of the problem of evil and how we have to answer it. So one of the things that I mentioned incidentally previously is I think the universalists, people who deny hell, end up committed to a view that God only allows things because they're metaphysically necessary for some good. God can only allow people to commit a sin if it's necessary, if God himself couldn't bring about that good without this evil, something like that. But I think this is a bad answer. So I think in general in theodicy, when it comes to giving a good reason that God has for allowing evil, I'd say the first thing to notice is we don't always have to give an answer. So there's in fact something called skeptical theism, which says, I don't know the answer, and that's good enough, right? Um, there's another that says, what I what I propose in the book is basically that God can have a good reason for allowing evil without it being necessary. So I think this is very clear for reasons of freedom. I don't refer to freedom in the book exactly, but I say something like this, right? God wants us for our own sake, but we're the sort of things that can commit sins and do moral evil. So maybe God wants us, and He doesn't. It's a good reason to allow evil because we are the sorts of things that can cause evil. But God can, on the other hand, He allows us to commit the evil. He could have stopped it all, but there might be a good reason why He doesn't for our sake. But as long as He can defeat all the evil that occurs. So I say God can allow evil on account of the greater goods. So the thought is something like this. Whatever God allows to happen, God would have a good reason because there's some good that comes in allowing the evils, and there's a good that comes in just allowing them to occur, like the setup where you're allowing the evils to occur can be good for certain reasons, in this case because there are us in the picture, and then because He can defeat the evils that happen. So the idea is something like God can be playing, sort of chess with everything that occurs. Everything that happens, God knows what's going to happen. God has planned it, foreseen it. He knows what's going to happen. And so any evil that occurs, God can defeat. So at the end of the day, He's going to not just compensate all the evils, but all the evils that are going to happen, He can defeat them. He can make them good in some way, indirectly. So that's the first thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say is, in terms of, I think revelation is actually the best answer. So in my opinion, I responded to a recent problem of evil, version of the problem of evil called the problem of divine hiddenness. I think this is a version of the problem of evil in some way. But I tend to think Christianity is essentially an answer to the problem of evil. I think that's what our revelation is about, because we tend to think something like this. Well, God does have a possible good reason, but He's told us what it is, and it turns out that part of the good reason that God allowed sin is because He wants to unite with us. And so the sin has set up a situation where we unite to God, and the sin at the end of the day, because we have this union with God in Christ, in Jesus, we have no sin, no evil in this world can really hurt us. And so even in this world, people are usually worried, why did God allow this? It's causing so much pain for me and all these other people. But I think Christianity sort of answers this problem because it says God has given us the means to overcome those things. They can't really hurt us. And in fact, all the evil that happens to us and to other people, we can use it to redeem the world, to be part of the redemption of the universe, just like Jesus took on the sins and pain and evil that happened to Him and turned it into a means for union with us. So I think that's the revealed answer, I think, is much more satisfying. Because in one way, it is a kind of I don't know for all the particular evil. I don't need to explain everything in particular to say I know God's in charge and I know that it's not going to harm me, right? So I'll just say on that note, I think in my own life, I have probably been angry at God or depressed with God's providence in some times in my life, but I don't think I ever doubted God's providence. I never thought, nobody's in charge, really. So I think it's a little autobiography, but I think that, for somebody who believes in God, you might end up in a position where you think, why did God allow this? Or I'm angry at God. I don't think those things are bad by themselves. Those are part of what it is to have a relationship with God and to grow in that way. So I just say that, If you believe God is provident, I've always thought there's God's providence is out there, right? God is in charge. Um, so I think that Christianity gives us a kind of an answer here.
That's very interesting. So I've also noticed that apart from your research on like Christian theology, you've also done a lot of research into Chinese philosophy. So my next question is, where do you see parallels between the ideas of Chinese philosophies like Confucianism and Taoism with classical theism?
Yeah, so I don't have much to do with Taoism. Um, there are people who have seen parallels with Taoism and Christianity and classical theism. So I would particularly recommend there was a Wu Jingsheng is a famous Chinese Catholic author, and he wrote a series of books about Chinese humanism was one of them. He wrote a series of books that deal with sort of classic Chinese uh, religions or philosophies and literature and Christianity. And he has one essay and one book actually on Taoism. I also have a friend of mine who wrote a dissertation on Taoism recently and its connections with natural law theory. So there are people that do that. My work has been on Confucianism and Buddhism. So I'll say with Confucianism, I think it's easy. So I'm writing a paper right now for a conference because most people ask me just what you asked, which is how can we be Christians and Confucians, or can you
Yeah.
be both? Uh, well, I think, yeah, I have no problem. And I think it's like obvious in the history of Confucianism. There have been lots of Christian Confucians and theistic Confucians who are not Christian. In Korea, for instance, there's one named Dasan. He was from a Catholic family, but he sort of left Catholicism behind. But he was very much a theist, very clearly. There are other classical Confucians that I think are very clearly theists. They believe in God, um, but they're not Christian. So I think there's no contradiction as such in that respect. But I think no contradiction is a very low bar. So um, what in Confucianism is good, or what's the connection? Well, I think the connection to things like Tian, the source of all goodness in the world, the source of ethical order. I study Zhu Xi, who's a medieval Confucian, and he tends to assimilate Tian with something called Li, which is like the pattern or structure of the world. And this pattern or structure is supposed to be the source of all moral goodness. At the deep foundation of reality, everything is somehow a reflection of this Li, and Li is supposed to be morally good in itself. It is moral goodness. That's
I
what it
see.
is.
Yeah.
And it's moral goodness conceived in a particular way. He says it is not just good, it is also the supreme virtue for the Confucians is Ren, which is this love, humaneness, compassion for other people. Zhu Xi assimilates Ren as the virtue with the emotion of love, I. He says Ren issues in I is the emotion. So I think this idea that the world is really in its deepest core, what it is somehow moral goodness is the structure of reality, and moral goodness really comes down to something like overpouring creative love. That's why things exist. I think this idea is very obviously sympathetic to Christians. This is
Yeah.
something that Christians are going to think is not a problem for us to believe in, right? So, in my opinion, I think the Confucians, there are points where I'm going to disagree with them. There are points where I would have to qualify what they would say. But I mean, it's the same with any classical philosophical school. I mean, Aristotle, Plato were used by the church fathers, by Thomas Aquinas, Augustine, all these people. Augustine's feast is tomorrow, by the way, in the Catholic Church. And he used a lot of Plato. Aquinas used a lot of Aristotle and Neoplatonic authors. But these ancient Greek schools of thought also had to be modified, right? They weren't just Christian before Christianity. right? So Confucianism isn't Christian before Christianity, but that doesn't mean that they didn't get a lot right. So the way I think of it is philosophy is a lot like science, right? Well, there's no Christian science. I mean, there's a kind of cult by that name, but there's no Muslim science, Christian science, Jewish
Yeah.
science. There's just science, right? And so people got a lot of these truths about God and reality and morality without the Bible, right? And so I'm just happy to say the Confucians got a lot right. And I think a lot of their views on reality and ethics are just the right views. So that's why I like them. That's why I think I'm a Confucian. Now, the last one is Buddhism. And I'll just say very quickly, I've written some things recently on Buddhism. It's more complicated because Buddhists are in some ways anti-theistic by philosophical commitment. So they basically have classical arguments in their canon that there is no God, right? Um, but in my recent papers, I've done two things. On the one hand, I have a paper called uh, being a not quite Buddhist theist, which is like, what's the difference between Buddhism and theism? What makes the difference? And I argued there that Buddhism is generally committed, I think, even in its, most of its forms in Mahayana Buddhism, to something that I think of as more pantheism. I'd say that's the closest they can get, is something like pantheism.
Okay.
And they'd have to reject something core to their commitments to become theists. Uh, but in the new paper I wrote called Unknowing, uh, I argued that some versions of Buddhism called Madhyamaka, they're a sort of Buddhism that says everything is empty. They focus on things being empty. And I say this kind of Buddhism might actually be in some ways more sympathetic to Christianity because these kinds of Buddhism are not pantheistic. They want to deny that everything is the Buddha nature and all that, right? They don't go that way, which is very typical of many other Mahayana schools. These Madhyamaka tend to think everything is empty because it's dependent on something else. But I think this is very sympathetic to a kind of Christian theism, because in Christianity, we think God himself. So I should say, in this school, when they argue there can't be a God, they argue because God is not dependent on anything. That's why there can't be a God. Everything has to be dependent. But this is true of every kind of theism except Christian theism, because Christians think God is a trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And in the classical Orthodox understanding of the Trinity in Christianity, the classic one from the 3, 4, 5, 600s, the way we understand the Trinity is God is dependent on himself, right? The Father, Son, and Spirit, to be
Yes.
God, is to be dependent on the other persons. And this is a central core belief about Christianity is that God is a kind of love and compassion, right? God is a kind of community. Well, this is the same thing that inspires Madhyamaka to say everything is dependent, is they say, well, that's why we have to be compassionate toward everything else, is because we're all dependent in this way. We have to empty ourselves so that we can be morally good and perfect. Well, I think this way of thinking about reality is ultimately very sympathetic with Christianity, because that's what we're saying too, is God is dependent. God empties himself in what he is in the Trinity eternally. And that's why all of reality is about love too, and self-emptying and giving. So I think, like the Confucians, Madhyamaka Buddhism has some potential to, we Christians can see it in a good way. So that's how I would uh, assimilate some of these things with Buddhism as well.
So basically, you think the concept of dependent origination in Buddhism can coexist with the idea of a creator God because this creator God is dependent on himself and therefore it still holds.
Correct. So dependent origination would hold even for God, because in the Trinity, we think that the persons of the Trinity are, in a certain sense, dependently originated.
Mm.
Trinitarian theology from the Thomistic Dominican tradition, my order, we call the Trinitarian persons subsistent relations.
I
So
see.
we think that what it is to be the Father, Son, and Spirit is to be in relation to the others. So that's exactly what we're saying, is that to be a person of the Trinity is to be dependently originated. So it depends what we mean by God depending on himself, because the point is what it is to be God is to be one of these persons. It's not to be dependent on yourself. It's to be dependent on the other, on the others, on the other persons.
Yeah.
So it's a complicated way of understanding God. But if you want to put it this way, just take the technical formulation of the Trinity, it fits dependent origination in the
Yes.
Madhyamaka tradition.
Mm. I was just wondering because I think some people interpret dependent origination as leading to this kind of cyclical vision of metaphysics where like the universe has no clear beginning or end and it's just constantly repeating. So how would you reconcile this with the idea that in Christianity there is a clear beginning and there is a clear end to the universe?
Well, I think so. The Madhyamakas are going to think the universe is eternal, generally
Mm,
speaking. Um, I don't think so. There are two things I could say on this particular criticism. The first is um, our doctrine of creation. We believe that the universe began to exist in time, but we think that that is a revealed doctrine. So Thomas Aquinas thought it could only be proven through revelation. He thought we couldn't for I could explain why he thought it, but the idea is he didn't think we could prove it.
okay.
He thought, for all we know, scientifically, the universe could have been eternal. Because even today, I mean, right, if there was a big bang, I think we have a high probability that that's when the universe came to exist. But some people think, well, maybe it came from a previous state of the universe. We just can't reach back that far with our science, right? Or there's some way that previous states are inaccessible. So this is what Aquinas thought: is whatever the first moment of the universe is, even though it did begin to exist in time, there might be some reason we can't prove it. Okay. But what he says is the doctrine of creation, that the universe is created by God from nothing,
Mm,
that doctrine we can prove, he thought. That's because he thinks these two things are different. So what is it to be created then? He said it's to be immediately dependent upon God for everything that you are, for your existence and being. So his image is, the universe could have been eternal, and it would, in every moment in eternity, be dependent on God. Like you might have, his image is a footprint in like mud or dust, right? So you have the footprint in the mud, right? And there's a shape in the mud at every point if the foot was there from eternity. But the shape of the footprint would be dependent on the foot, right? There wouldn't be that shape if the foot wasn't there. So that's the same way that the universe would be eternally dependent on God. Okay, so why am I bringing that up? Because here's what you could say for the Madhyamakas is um, we could say for the Madhyamakas that everything at every point in the past, even if the universe was eternal, would be dependent on God this way. And the Madhyamakas don't need to say everything is dependent on everything else all the time, right? They only need to say everything that exists is dependent on some prior cause, right? Or something else, right? That's all they need to say. They don't need to say every cause is dependent on every cause in the future and past, right? That would be, I think, a little crazy, a little too much, right? For that they don't need that, right? And it would be implausible. So what we could say is, well, the universe depends on God and God depends on himself. So there's dependent origination all the way down. So even if the universe then began to exist in time, right, the Madhyamakas don't have to deny that lots of things begin to exist in time, right? So there's nothing about their views that I think requires the universe to be eternal. I think if I put it this way, if God is the way we think it is, then you can have dependent origination and a temporally beginning universe because it
mm,
turns out the dependent origination was eternal in God. So there wouldn't be any problem in holding both. I think if you didn't have the Trinitarian God, then you might think you've just got to have the eternal universe, right? Um, but yeah, I mean, I think that the view is theoretically compatible with Madhyamaka. I'm not saying that Madhyamakas hold this view, which is a different thing. But my point is something like they don't see, I think, they never encountered this view historically, but the Trinitarian view is sort of compatible with dependent
Okay.
origination.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for the explanation. My last question is basically linking together everything we've discussed about classical theism and its parallels with Chinese philosophy, which is, in general, how important do you view interfaith dialogue, and what are the best strategies to optimize it?
Well, so the first thing to say is dialogue with Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism, I don't exactly think of as interfaith dialogue. There's a long debate about what's religion and all this for purposes of sociology. I'm a philosopher, and so my engagement with Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism is as philosophy primarily,
I
not
see.
really
Okay.
as religion. There are, I should say, and it's kind of hard to say, who do I want to engage with as a Confucian faith, right? I think because there really isn't anything. There's no Confucian pope out there that we can go meet. And to some extent with the Taoists, that's true as well. Although there are Taoist organizations, they don't generally, in my opinion, I'm not very familiar with them, but they don't seem to me to be very interested in the philosophy. So, to a great extent, I think Taoist philosophy, if I'm doing something with Taoist philosophy in Christianity or theism, it probably wouldn't impact much what Taoists are
Okay.
doing. Um,
Right.
so, Buddhism is a little different. The Catholic Church does have engagement with them at a formal level, at the international level. We have engagement with Buddhist organizations. So, let me say two things, one about them, which is what we call interreligious dialogue,
Hmm.
and then something a little bit about specifically interfaith. So I have a new book about uh, interchristian unity called Whoever Hears You Hears Me, Dogmatic Authority is Testimony. And I should say I'm very committed to it because I believe that um, faith is necessary for salvation. So I think right faith, orthodox faith, not believing crazy bad things, is important because I don't think that religion is good just by itself. Right? A lot of people tend to think being religious is good, whatever you believe, as long as you sincerely believe it. But I think that that's false, right? Somebody can sincerely believe that all people of different races are devils and they need to be murdered, right? They can sincerely believe that, but they'd be evil for believing it, right? They wouldn't be
Yes.
good for believing it. Or people who fly planes into buildings, right? They can be sincere in their religious beliefs that flying planes into buildings and killing hundreds of people is what God wants them to do, but they'd be evil for believing that. Their
Hmm.
religion would be evil. So it'd be false, at least, even if we say maybe they were raised a certain way in an environment where they couldn't really easily believe anything else. Doesn't matter, it's still false. Okay. So I think that it really matters what we believe. I don't think religion is good just by itself. Good religion is different from bad religion, and true religion is good religion. Um, so I think that unity among religions, Christianity in particular, is part of what Christianity is about. Christianity says, we want to be united in search for the truth. Don't want to be divided over stupid things. We want to be united in what matters. We want to allow people the freedom to have their own opinions, but we want to be united in what God has told us. And we want
Hmm.
to, it's not just a matter of intellect, right? It's also a matter of heart because we think the goal for all human beings is to love and know God, right? And to love each other. So we think the church ought to be one, right? It's a scandal for us Christians that there are many different kinds of Christianity that are all fragmented and fighting each other. So I'm very committed that we need to overcome it. But I think the way we overcome it is both practical and theoretical. So we need to be creative in thinking, how do we see the other person's views from within their own mind and figure out where we meet and how we can be creative to figure out how we in fact can come together around some issues. So my new book is trying to argue that among Christians. And now to go back to the interreligious, I think this is important for missionary work. So I mean, as a Christian, I think I am supposed to share the gospel with people from other places. Confucianism and Buddhism. When I write about them, I think they have lots of true things to say. I don't think they're bad, right? But I don't think they're Christianity, right? And I think that people in those places would also need to discover Christianity. There's something good about them discovering it, and I wish they would be Christian. But on my side, like what I said about myself, I don't think you need to give up everything that's good in Confucianism to become Christian. I don't want oatmeal religion where everyone just looks the same. I would want people to have their own traditions and cultures, and I would want to say what's good in Confucianism, what's good in Buddhism can now be baptized and become part of the true unity of humanity, right?
Yes.
Everything that's good is part of the same, we're on the same team, right? So that's what I would want to do. That's why I think studying these religions is important, is because I can be creative and say, there is a way for me to understand even atheist Buddhism. Atheist Buddhism is not as atheist as it might seem, right? There are things in Buddhism that I can read from within a Christian lens and show that we don't have to give up everything that's good in Buddhism to become Christian, right? You can do both. You can do both without being a syncretist. A syncretist is somebody who believes like these incompatible religious things, right? We don't need to be syncretists to baptize these other religions, right? We don't need to just tear down everything they've built, right? Burn it to the ground and build our churches on top. That's not the right way to think about it. We want to bring them all together, right? We want to show them that even from within what they have, Christianity is the fulfillment of what they already believe. So that's sort of how I think about a lot of this is, from within Confucianism, from within Buddhism, you can see why Christianity would be a good idea from within those views. And I'll just end with one story about that gives you the thought. Korea, the Christian church, the Catholic Church in Korea started exactly this way. It wasn't Western missionaries. No Western missionary came to Korea to start the Catholic Church there. Here's what happened. There was a group of Confucian scholars. They had a reading club, and they got some books from China in classical Chinese that were parts of the Summa Theologiae of Thomas Aquinas translated into classical Chinese, some writings by Matteo Ricci, The True Doctrine of the Lord of Heaven, and some other works from the Jesuits. And they read these works, and they were convinced that it completed what they already knew in Confucianism. They thought this was the right version of Confucianism, just the right version of Confucianism for them. And so they baptized each other and said, this is the version of Confucianism we want. And they were followers of Jushi, the person I study, right? They thought this was like the completion of everything Jushi wanted in his philosophy. So to me, that's like the paradigm of what it is to do interreligious dialogue.
Nice.
Is they baptized each other and then they wrote letters to the West to ask somebody to send a bishop to come ordain priests for them, because they said, we're all Christian now, we baptized each other, so we want some priests to come over and bring copies of the Bible and theology and ordain people as priests, because we know we need that. But they had already converted and they were running the church by themselves. Wow. And that's what I think is the right way to think about it, right?
Yeah.
We all want to be one, but that doesn't mean we just eliminate what we are. It's about seeing that everything that's good in us, we Catholics have this word, right? We call it the Catholic Church. And what we mean is it's the universal church. It's just the true church. It's the reality it's the religion of truth, of reality. So if we delve down into the reality and the truth of these other religious views, we get to the same thing.
That's a very interesting perspective. Thank you for sharing. I think that brings us to the end of this interview. So thank you.